When I talk about the self-reclamation journey of, walking the creative path, a lot of it for me personally has been, that I would expend and lose energy, worrying too much about perceptions of what I would say or what I would do, like being in this place of judgment. And then, like you say, here 20 years later, having like said yes to that wrestle of, I don't accept that I should be hemorrhaging my energy in this way. I mean, part of it is, would you agree with this? As you get older, you realize the value of your life force so much more. It's just like, it's absolutely intolerable. And, it's that whole quote about, how youth is wasted on young people because you think it's just like this, infinite reserve that's not going to run dry. But for me, there's definitely a sense these days that, it's time to speak out. It's time to write down ideas. It's time to have a voice. Definitely not time to be worrying about what other people think. And I think, in terms of those archetypal stages, a lot of women say, yeah, it's great to get to the goddess crone place because, the maiden is fraught with, what's the word, when just being subject to expectations of others, your
fraught with
attention.
fraught with insecurities.
Fraught with insecurities, yeah.
Yeah, there was for me, my 20s was just completely ravaged by insecurity. And now you're right, as we get older, that becomes less important. You just realize you don't have that time to waste anymore on, am I pretty enough? Am I thin enough? Am I smart enough? I mean, all of those sorts of things. But I want to say, I had this really interesting conversation the other day with my girlfriend about life force energy. And she's like, I really think it's not, when we think about, pardon me, getting older and aging, she's like, I think we just start to disallow the life force energy. Like people get older and maybe we talk specifically like about retirement, and then they just go and they watch TV. They just allow less and less space within themselves for that life force energy to move through them. And then eventually the life force just stops and says, okay, well, I guess we're done here. If you're not going to continually like keep that fire burning, if you're not going to continue to stoke that fire, I've got other places to be. And that's what death is. And so for you to hear you talk about, it's not the time to keep your mouth shut. It's not the time to, stop working with the creative force and to engage with all of these things. That to me is like, you're still there. You're still available for that life force. And that's thinking about how we move through these cycles, is just realizing that that energy might show up in a different way, but it's still available to us if we're available to meet it where it's at too.
Yeah, we make the space. Is it fair to say that artists and creatives don't really age in the same way? And I would say it's because of making that space. It's like, I think the creative journey is defined by making intentional space to engage, to explore with some kind of creative modality. And in that, you're making a space of inquiry. And I think that's what makes, again, talk about this rite of passage, is that because of that space and because of what occurs there, it is likely that your perspectives are going to fall out of step with a lot of the people around you. You become less of a servant of reality, to use some of Cassia's wonderful phrasing, and you become a creator. You occupy a different position. And within that, you know, if you just think about what you were talking about, like the idea of channeling life force, and you know, you use that example of like someone who loses their role and into retirement, and they don't have that space, that playground for the energy to play, it will stagnate. It's not hasn't got space to move. That there does become like a bit of a tipping point where it's like you have to make that choice about what you're going to consciously make space for, and that choice is going to define the second half of your life. And you will experience the results of that. Because for people who have got stuff going on, you know, they really value their time and their resources, and they have this kind of what is it, like this innate sense of gratitude to have time and space to like work on things. Like they're never going to fall into that category of not knowing what to do, or you know, feeling like that the passing of time is like some kind of, I don't know, non-event. You know, it's just a really different way of being. So
Well,
yeah.
I like how you started this conversation talking about choice, because the only constant is change, right? Like, so we are things are always in like dynamic progression, but how do we choose to engage with that change, with the pretty much the only constant that exists, right? So we're always going to be evolving in some way, but how do we do that in a way where we take advantage of that life force energy, where we stay feeling vibrant, where we still can follow that aliveness that we talk about so much? And it's like the choice to say, and this, I guess, the consciousness, the sense that yes, things are in this dynamic flow, this ever emergent experience. And how do I uh, choose to engage with that?
Yeah, I mean, the how to, I think, is that you actively choose to create space. If there's anything that ever has value, you honor that value by giving it space. If it's a friend, you give them time. If it's an object, you give it a place to be, and so forth. It's the same thing. And I think that's really like the tipping point around, you know, what's the choice to be made in terms of like, you know, we've had past conversations that the creative journey exists in a set apart place that is waiting for us and is calling for us, but we cannot go there until we choose it, until we claim it. And we often have to choose it and claim it against the tide. We do it in spite of, so often, you know, it's not like we grow up with the people that, you know, are closest to us, with the talking about when and how we will do the inevitable thing, which is to self-actualize in some way through creative expression. That is never on the table to discuss. It's not a thing. You know, you can talk about retirement, you can talk, you know, you can talk about your long-term job plans, and you can talk about your pension, you can talk about, these are considered the inevitables. But the idea that you'll make space to to wrestle with your own psyche, consciousness, and being through some kind of creative modality is like the most essential thing that you can do, that will create space to ensure that life force keeps flowing, so that you can be present in every capacity in life.
You know, hearing you talk about how sometimes making that conscious choice to engage with this creative journey sometimes sets you apart. And I was thinking about that is true, and yet we still need to have people around us. And so I was doing some reading, and they were talking about, like, we see this cycle of birth, death, rebirth. We see it even just with the, you know, sunrise, sunset. We see it with the seasons, right? And if you think about the trees and in the autumn, and they start to lose their leaves, that that's significant that they do lose their leaves, because those leaves then provide for the same um, the same processes for, like, if those leaves weren't there, the worms would die in the winter. The bugs wouldn't have a place to nestle to make it through until the spring. And so we need to make sure that we are still moving through these processes within an ecosystem, understanding that we are part of an ecosystem. So last time we talked all about the importance of having allies as we move through the creative process. And I think that that's important to, we don't have to revisit those points, but just remember that these cycles exist within a larger ecology, and that as much of, as true as it is to say that we are um, on this journey alone, we need to remember that as our leaves fall, as things decay, and that doesn't even just mean physically, even if we think about it in a smaller sense, in a microcycle of like a project or a chapter of our life, that those things that we are releasing, those things that we are surrendering to, then also give birth and give rise to the stuff that's within our orbit, the community, the ecosystem with that we exist in. And I thought that that was such a cool thing to think about, is that stuff that we think is death or decay provides opportunities for other things, whether it's energetically, whether, it's actual like physical resources, or things like you passing on stuff that no longer, works for you or resonates or is in alignment, that somebody else then can take up those tools or those resources for their own growth. And just remembering that this also exists individually, but it also exists within a larger sphere.
Mm, yeah. Seems like there's a concurrent theme about space, the creating of space. As you were talking, I felt like you were touching on the importance of letting go. That, for example, I would say a big part of this journey is the creative journey as the rite of passage is letting go of the need to share the same worldview, perspective in order to connect. Like, it's not like a prerequisite. I don't actually require that or need that, and therefore that it is possible to have close friendships and connections, and to have a healthy relationship with people who experience life differently and have different priorities. I think that's like one of the steeper arcs of the journey, but that's kind of where it's pointing to. I think initially it's a bit of a like, you gotta we started this whole podcast with the rebellious F you, I'm going for it, I'm the rebel. And here we are, we seem to be talking like that opposite end, where it's like a much more integrated, slow pace of making space for that which we value, and allowing the alchemy of choosing that space to affect all the areas of our life, to ensure that everything has a space as it needs, as it is, not to be fighting with the way that things are, to be kind of like, I think it's that thing, when we talk about the dynamics, it's like you're rooted in what you know, but there's always a bracket around what you know for now. You're preparing to constantly revisit, and that you've got to be so humble to be like, I was so sure about X, and now it looks like this, and now it looks like that. And you know there's a lot
Think
of there's a lot of movement, and that's also a difficult thing, I think, for some of like your wider environment to keep up with. Oh, I thought you thought this, and now you think this, and you were doing that, and now you're doing this. Like, yeah, that's normal for this kind of, when you make that kind of space and you engage and you play in this kind of way, you're gonna move quickly through things. Some things will endure. That's the beauty of this time of life, I think, is that you have a little chance to do an audit and be like, looks like some things are here to stay. I don't know. Now we're tipping into a whole other conversation, but it could be a
well,
good one.
I think it was so refreshing to hear you say being able to have friends who don't have the same view as you, and that not mean anything more than, oh wow, that's interesting. Let's explore that. Let's see where the same, where, because I don't know if it's the same dynamic in the UK or in Portugal, but in the United States, everything is, if unless you are on my team, you're bad, evil, wrong, whatever. And so there's no opportunity. Like I was having this conversation with somebody the other day, and he was talking about, he's like, oh, he's okay, but he thinks this. And I was like, who cares? So that's interesting. Like, why does it have to be bad that he has a different way of seeing something than you? I'm like, that I love that you said that, because I almost said the exact words. I said it's not a prerequisite for friendship in my mind for somebody to have the exact same thoughts as
Mm.
I do, or the same values even. Like, I think that that's what makes it interesting, right? I mean, think
Mm.
about where art comes from. Think about where creativity comes from. There, we've talked a lot about that tension. Like, it's okay to have that tension in worldviews with people around you, and I think that's necessary. I think it's actually, in a sense, like that's where some of the nourishment, some of the juicy parts of our creative process comes from, thinking about things in different ways, hearing different ideas than you're used to, contemplating values that might not be your own. And even if you don't come to the same conclusion of that person, that process of even if it's just reaffirming who you are, what you think, where you stand, all of that, that's where some of that inspiration comes from. And even some of that discontent, even working through that discomfort from having ideas that are not necessarily your own. I think that that's where a lot of ideas and the spark of creativity comes from. So it was so refreshing to hear you say that, because in my world, people, it's like, if you're not on my team, I don't want to hear what you have to say. And I think that that not only does that not bring us to the world that we want to live in, I think if we were to take that all the way through and say, does this mindset lead us to the world the ideal world that we'd like to see? But it also, that doesn't spark anything. That doesn't inspire anything within either.
It's a tricky one, this terrain, because in a way I'm hearing that you're basically describing how you are how your value system shows up, which is to make space for the disagreement, for the contrast, for the ways that things don't fit. But I guess someone who doesn't have space for that is also being true to their value system, which is they do not value the space for those kind of mismatches. That is not a part of their value system. It kind of like, in a way, everyone's just kind of expressing in their own way. Like you say, they're inner tensions, their inner dynamics, what the value systems are, and it shows up in where space is made. I keep coming back to that. I do think it's the thread through this conversation that we learn a lot about where we choose space and where we encounter it and where we don't. And it's very easy to feel like, oh, of course, it's much better to have space. Maybe that's a conversation for another day. It's hard not to feel like we obviously have a strong bias and preference for the values of space and everything that it means that you get to enjoy. I guess we'd have to have a chat with someone who might want to talk about, I don't even know how you could have a conversation about that, because without like making assumptions, but it's kind of, we all get something from our value systems as payoffs left, right, and center. We get a payoff for choosing, the pros and cons of choosing the creative path and making that space, and then there'll be the pros and cons of not making that space. And
I I do think it comes back though to your idea of certainty. I
certainty.
think that, and this, I'll speak for myself, but I think you would probably agree that being able to be in those liminal spaces, to be
Mm.
able to hang out in places that are uncertain, is difficult for people. And I think that that's why there's such a need to, like, draw a line in the sand, and this is where I stand. And if you're not there with me, um, I can't have you in my space because it creates too much uncertainty, and I'm not okay with that. So I think that being, we've talked about art as a form of, or our creative process and creativity as a form of personal growth. It's allowed us to be able to navigate, I think, those and kind of swim in that uncertainty in a way without feeling it necessary to just get really like rigid. Like it allows for that sense of flexibility, because we have the opportunity, we have the tools to be able to like say, okay, this makes me feel uncomfortable, this makes me feel mad or angry or whatever the case may be, and I have a way to transmute that. I have a way to modulate it. I have a way to play with it in a way that's safe, a way that's exploratory, a way that maybe, in fact, might even be inspirational, to take that and turn it into a painting or a poem or any sort of work of art. But I think it comes down to people, everything in this world right now, especially in the United States. I mean, in this past week, we've had an attempted assassination on an ex-president. We had another president step down. Like it's an uncertain time here. Like there's so much going on that's just kind of pushing and pulling us. And I think it goes back even to the beginning of that conversation about where our power is and how we move that power, outward and back inward, with so much swirling around us. Like how do we not want to just grasp on things that say, okay, at least I don't know much, but I know this, and it's easier for me to have people who know this as well around me versus other people who feed into that chaos and uncertainty.
There's a lot of vulnerability and certainty that I've had to come to terms with as well, though. That, there's, because as I listen, I'm like nodding in agreement to this beautiful description of swimming in uncertainty, and then of course applying that to how things are. You can see how very helpful it is to be able to exist in the liminal space of neither here nor there. And then I think there's also something maybe more for me than you, which I'm like, I know that I'm more comfortable in those spaces for a reason, than neither here nor there. And maybe there's something to be said at some point that it has to be called. The line has to be drawn. But I was also listening to what you're saying. So it's like somehow coming back to this notion of space, having space to know what one is thinking, why one might be thinking it, and to choose it, to actually be able to choose how we are thinking, is perhaps the rite of passage of humanity, like to know what you're thinking or why you're thinking it, and to choose your thoughts. I mean, I don't know, like a personal example of this is, way back at the very beginning of the painting journey, where I'm just right at the beginning of like experiencing myself, someone very creatively engaged, and being like, oh, I think there's something here for me that I can like grow into and expand into. And knowing that I had a very like overactive thinking, like I'd burn my adrenals out with worrying and obsessive thoughts. And the relationship I was in at the time was very destructive, very difficult, probably could get labeled toxic these days, toxic relationship. And so a huge amount of my energy would get spent on obsessing on the difficulties. And then at some point I was just like, look what goes on in my mind. Look what goes on in my mind. And because I've had the experience of choosing to put my attention onto the painting, it occurred to me that I could choose to put my attention somewhere else in my mind. And it was such like a crude thing to like rip my obsessive brain off the thing that had been so used to chewing on, and be like, what about something over there? Like something that could be, and it'd be like, why don't you think about, what you might want to be doing with your day, or, put your effort into. At the time, it was just like, everything was on the table, like, write your CV, do this, do that. Like, and I can still really remember, like, you know, the sound of Velcro. It kind of sounds like that to me, like that habitual place. It's something to be reckoned with, right? Becoming familiar with the terrain of your own mind and being like us, being able to be reflexive enough to ask yourself, do I choose this? Do I own this thinking process, or am I reactive? Am I simply reacting? It's that thing about reactive versus to react or to create, react or to create. And yeah, the US is going to have to decide.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact quote, and this is a bummer, but there's a Carlos Castaneda quote that's like, you can either make yourself miserable or you can make yourself, it's either happy, content, something like that. But the amount of work is the same.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That lands. Yeah.
So
That was kind of like the dawning realization for me at that time, was just like, look, I'm expending huge energy either way. Like, let me see some fruits from my labor, or just more of the same, more of the same, more of the same.
yes.
Nice. Okay.